there's a liberation in knowing that we're not pointing to ourselves. We're not saying to people, be like me. We're pointing both ourselves and other people away from ourselves and saying there is one who it's worth thinking about and being like, and it's not me, thank goodness, but it's him. Let me show you. Let me show you who this one is like.
Hello and welcome back to another episode of the Upside Down People podcast. It's an absolute privilege to be chatting with Christopher Watkin. Chris is an author, philosopher, scholar and teacher, and his most recent book, Biblical Critical Theory, has been awarded the 2023 Australian Christian Book of the Year. His research seeks to make sense of how people make sense of the world. And in our conversation, Chris shows us how the Bible and its unfolding story help us make sense of modern life and culture. We're excited to get into it with Chris, so let's jump into it. Chris, thanks so much for joining in our podcast and having a conversation. Really excited to have a conversation around your book, Biblical Critical Theory, that you've recently published. And just for our listeners, I'm joined here with a friend of mine, Mark Taffing.
Hey, Chris. Good to meet you.
Cool. So, Chris, just as a form of getting to know you, maybe we can start off by sharing a bit about yourself, what motivated you to write this book, Biblical Critical Theory, and then just a bit about who you are.
That's wonderful. Yeah, thank you, Caleb and Mark. Lovely to be with you. Lovely to be chatting with you. I am, as listeners will no doubt already have been able to tell, a Yorkshireman from England, living over here with my wife and family over here, being Melbourne, since 2011 now. So feeling thoroughly Australian, apart from in any sporting context, where my youth sort of surges to the fore again, and I'm a passionate England supporter. Been a Christian since I was 15, 16. And been into philosophy since, I guess, early university days. I got serious about that. And that's what, I guess, comes together in the book, really. So you can imagine me as a fresh-faced undergraduate, secular arts faculty of a big university, and sort of being thrown all these books week after week. Derrida, Marx, Freud, Nietzsche, Beauvoir, Christeva, just all these big names. And also rocking up to church on Sunday and, being taught to take the Bible seriously and read it carefully and try and apply it to the whole of life, and thinking, okay, well, how do these two worlds touch each other? Not that they ought to agree with each other, but like, how do you speak in a way that crosses these two worlds? How do you get the Bible to speak to the conversations that these, theoreticians are having among themselves and the big debates that they're discussing? And very slowly, through sort of reading a bunch of stuff and speaking to lots of people and listening to lots of sermons and falling down and dusting myself off and getting up again, biblical critical theory came out the other side. So it's sort of the sum of 15 or 20 years of grappling with that question myself, and all the stuff that I've learned and found really useful. The short version being, Bible overviews are really cool, and the biblical story as a framework for engaging with culture is just incredibly rich and helpful. And Augustine knew what he was talking about, I guess, is the second takeaway when he wrote The City of God. Like, he's doing the thing that I was looking for as an undergraduate, although I hadn't read him at that point.
Yeah, very good. And what would you say, I suppose, yourself being an academic and a teacher, I'm sure you have many different influences. Is there someone, a particular philosopher or theologian that you've been particularly influenced by or enjoy their thinking?
It's a really interesting question, Caleb. I think there are two sorts of philosophers, and I'm the second sort. So the first sort is you find one person you really resonate with, and you just like write on them for the rest of your life. So they, within philosophical circles, there are Kant people, and whatever they write, it's through a Kantian lens, and there are Heidegger people and Foucault people. And I've never really been that sort of philosopher. I've always sort of tried to range quite broadly and find things in different thinkers that I find really helpful and then put them together. And same theologically, I guess. John Stott was a big influence early on in undergraduate days. The way he wrote about culture, I just found really faithful to the Bible, but also taking culture seriously and trying to understand it in its own terms. I found G.K. Chesterton not only a great deal of fun and just hilarious, but also incredibly insightful culturally. Like, he does things that I haven't found other people doing, or as well as he does. So he was key. C.S. Lewis, relatively early on, a little bit later than John Stott, but again, the way that he takes biblical themes and reads culture through them in a way that seeks to honor, the integrity of culture and take it seriously, but not compromise on biblical truth, was just really, really helpful. Esther Meek, later on, she wrote that brilliant book on covenantal epistemology, and that's been a real pattern for me of how to take an idea from the Bible and rethink from the ground up a basic philosophical question through it. Really key there. And there are lots more in the book as well. Those are just some that come to mind pretty quickly, but there's no one person that I would say, look, I'm a John Stott person, or I'm a G.K. Chesterton person. Right. It's not like that.
Yeah, very good. So let's dive into a bit of what you talk about in your book, Biblical Critical Theory. It's a very in-depth and great book. I just recently finished reading it, and for our listeners, are you able to give it a quick snapshot of what it's about and why you felt you needed to write it?
I'll do my best. It'll be up for the listeners to see whether I've succeeded or not. So its basic structure is the biblical storyline. So we start off with creation and we move through the Bible pretty slowly in Genesis, but then we speed up a lot, running through the Old Testament, hitting some of its high points. And then, there's a chapter on the incarnation, ministry of Jesus, death, resurrection, and so forth. And we finish up in Revelation 22. So it takes the shape of the biblical story, and along the way, it tries to engage with the important questions of modern culture through that biblical lens. So we're looking at, everything from environmentalism to freedom and equality and peace and all those big issues, that come up on the news again and again and again. Trying to think, if we rethought those things and almost sort of forgot what we knew about them from modern culture, but tried to rethink them from the ground up biblically, what would we come up with? And then how would those ideas that have been drawn out of the Bible interface with and perhaps challenge, or sometimes even perhaps affirm what modern culture is saying about those same things? And the language that I use for that in the book is letting the Bible set its own table. So I think a danger often when we try to engage with culture as Christians is we take the questions that culture is asking at face value and we try and sort of squeeze the Bible into them. But often it's the way the questions are posed themselves that's the problem. And if we let the Bible, set its own table, talk about things using its own language in the way that it wants, and then bring that to the cultural questions, you often find you get a deeper, richer and fresher and more exciting perspective than if you just let the culture set the agenda and try and answer its questions in its own terms.
In your book, you talk about these different ways that cultures relate to God, and you use the shapes of N and U, how N is sort of this not secular way that the culture relates to God, but just how majority of people may relate to God. And then in this contrast, this way Christians ought to relate to God. Do you mind talking into that?
I'd love to. It's a wonderful biblical truth, really sort of refreshing and liberating, I think, in a lot of ways. So thank you for the opportunity to talk about it a little bit. In the book, I use the language of the N-shaped dynamic and the U-shaped dynamic. Just for the sake of putting labels on ideas, really. Like, you don't need to remember those terms, but the things that they describe are really, really important. So the N-shaped dynamic is how almost everybody in the history of different cultures has thought we relate to ultimate reality. And you can include most religions in this, and also secular culture as well. And the idea is that it's an effort-reward scheme. So you put in the effort and you get the reward. And if you think about the letter N, if you start writing it from the left-hand side, first of all, you go up, and then you sort of crest at the top, and then you go down the other side. And it's that idea. So the up arc is the effort. You perform, you do something that's worthy. And then the downstroke is the reward that you get at the other side. And so religiously, this looks like a lot of ancient sacrifice. If you give the God what it wants, you do the sacrifice, then the God will bless you and you'll get fertility, or you'll get rain, or you'll get whatever you want. Effort reward, performance reward. But it's also how modern secular society works, isn't it? How almost everything works. Performance reviews at work, for example. Have you performed at the required level to get the reward? It's increasingly, I think, how relationships work, and this is rather problematic, because relationships don't work terrifically well when we're always judging each other and saying, are you meeting a certain performance standard? Because if not, I'm not going to reward you. And that's what Michael Sandel talks about in his book, What Money Can't Buy, how this idea of performance and reward is sort of creeping over the whole of society today. It's not just, the market anymore. It's not just buying and selling stuff. It's infusing the way we think about it. And so that's just sort of the air that almost all cultures have breathed. And we don't even really think about it today. Yeah, well, of course, you put in the effort, you get the reward. You don't put in the effort, you don't get the reward. That's just how life works. That's how we roll. But it's not how the Bible rolls. And this is so hard to get our heads around. I think even as Christians, it's really hard to get our heads around. But especially if you're not a Christian and you're coming to the Bible for the first time, this is just off the charts weird. That the God of the Bible doesn't relate to people in this performance reward paradigm. It's not, if you perform to a sufficient standard, God will bless you. And I think that is still the God that a lot of people think is in there in the Bible. If I'm good, I'm okay and I'll go to heaven. It's that performance reward narrative. But it just doesn't work in the Bible, because the Bible has a U-shaped dynamic, in the sense that if you think of how you draw a lowercase u, first of all, you got the downstroke on the left-hand side. You start at the top, you go down, and then you go up. And so what I'm trying to get over with that is that God first blesses us. God first reaches out to us in grace, not in a response to any merit of ours, and initiates a relationship. And then our response to God is one of gratitude. I can't believe it. You've saved me by grace. This is amazing. Let me worship you. Let me praise you. Let me obey you. But you don't praise and worship and obey God to get the reward. You praise and worship and obey God within a Christian way of looking at things because you've already got the reward. And that just overturns so many assumptions and patterns of society. I think it revolutionizes the way that we think about, for example, how we care for the weakest people in society, people who can't perform, people who don't earn their way. Little children and babies is one. Older people who have lost mental capacity is another. And I think a U-shaped dynamic throws up a really different paradigm for thinking about society in terms of those groups than the N-shaped dynamic. And in lots of other different areas as well. I think it's not just an abstract theological point, but it's actually got concrete implications for distinctively Christian ways of thinking about society.
Chris, could I ask you, in terms of the application of that, I think it's a marvelous picture. It reminds me, I think it was C.S. Lewis who was making a cup of tea and heard of a few people discussing what's distinct about Christianity and turned around and said grace. I think, I forget, but there's an anecdote similar to that. And it reminds me of that the kind of the grace of God leads us to gratitude. When we think about the application of that into some structures, so whether it's workplace and you have a Christian business owner, or parenting our children, or as Christians, whatever it may be. Maybe it's too granular. Maybe you don't want to answer the question. That's okay. But how does it work itself into those structures that exist? And there's so many ways that we think, you kind of, our schooling systems, or, you get out what you put in type of that in kind of structure, like you've suggested, I think. So how do we as Christians take this concept that you've given us into these spaces that we fill our lives with?
Yeah. I think fundamentally, like at the end of the day, when I've done all my talking, everyone needs to work that out in their own unique circumstances, because it will look slightly different for everyone. So I just put that down as a sort of caveat. So I can't for two reasons. First of all, because I don't have the experience, and secondly, because everyone's different, say what this is going to look like in an individual, specific person's life. But I'll try my best to sort of sketch in some broad contours. It's not a question, obviously, of never rewarding good behavior. So like, it's not, as a Christian parent, I need to sort of give my child whatever they want, regardless of whether they, just burn down the house or not. No, but it's a question of what has priority and what acts as a frame for everything. So in modern society, there's grace, there's gifts, there's forgiveness. But the fundamental heartbeat of that society is one of performance and reward. And where there are grace and forgiveness and so forth, it's little islands within that ocean of performance and reward. So it's the N-shaped dynamic that frames everything. And then you've got these little exceptions here and there. And they're wonderful exceptions, but they are exceptions of the U-shaped dynamic. I think biblically it's the opposite. It's the U-shaped dynamic that is most fundamental and that frames ultimate reality. And then within that, within a family or within a workplace, you're going to want to have ways of rewarding people who've done particularly well. And there's nothing fundamentally wrong with that, unless it becomes the fundamental heartbeat of reality. And then you get into all these issues with, well, what about little babies? What about older people who can no longer perform, and so forth? And so I think as a Christian business owner or a Christian parent, or just any Christian interacting in society, a really helpful diagnostic question to ask ourselves is, what is the fundamental heartbeat of the way that I see my relationship with God, first of all, because that's where everything flows from, and then how I see my relationship with other people. So do I see my relationship with God fundamentally, if I'm being honest with myself, in the quietness when nobody's listening? Do I fundamentally see it as one of performance and reward? Like when I've had a few days of relative obedience, I feel on top of the world, and I crack my Bible open in the morning and sort of waltzing, with my chest puffed out. And, when I've sinned, I stay away from God because I think he won't accept me now. Well, if that's my experience of God, then there's a good chance that I'm operating on this N-shaped paradigm in my relationship with God. And I shouldn't be. And there's work I need to do there. And similarly, if I look at the business that I run, or if I look at my family, am I relating to the members of my family primarily as a function of how well they've performed in my eyes and met whatever it is that I have as my criteria for good performance? It might not be that obvious to them, but it might be pretty clear in my own thinking, my own self-talk, what I say to myself, quietly inside my own head. When I analyse that, it might be clear that I'm relating primarily to these people in terms of their performance. Or am I relating to people and seeking to create a culture of relationships that is fundamentally grace-based, within which there's room for performance and reward, but it never becomes the ultimate reality? That would be, I guess, a high-level diagnostic question, and then everyone would need to work that out in terms of their own circumstances and their own particular life situation.
Great.
Yeah, I think it's super helpful to have that. It's a very simple framework that you give in terms of that visual picture of the N and the U, in the way we can understand like where we can diagnose our heart in relation to God. Yeah, I thought that was like a brilliant part that you included in your work. Moving or shifting gears a bit, you talk about the tension between faith and reason as well in book, and how I suppose I'm curious to know how modernity's view of faith as irrational and private speculation, and the postmodern thought that it's merely relative and archaic, or that it inhibits like your personal autonomy, influences our Christian faith, and how the gospel should guide us in responding to that.
Yeah, thank you, Caleb. Thank you. A lot of what I've got to say on this is in debt to Tim Keller, who's another one of the people I could have mentioned at the beginning, who's been a real help and a real positive influence on my thinking. And he has this really helpful way of talking about this. He says, hopefully I'm paraphrasing accurately, that modernity siphons off all the faith onto one side and all the reason onto the other side. So it pits faith against reason. And it says, if you're a modern secular person, you're basically in the reason camp. And if you're religious, if you're Christian, you're in the faith camp. And so you're either basing your view of the world exclusively and exhaustively on things that can be reasoned about, or you're basing your view of the world ultimately and exhaustively on things that require a faith commitment. And the sort of faith that modernity likes to think Christians have is what commonly gets called a blind faith. So I've absolutely no reason for believing, that there's a God whatsoever, but hey-ho, quite a comforting belief, so let's believe it anyway. That sort of belief. And this is quite a recent idea, I think, about faith. It's really crystallized in the thinking of Søren Kierkegaard and his idea of a leap of faith. And for him, it can't be proper faith unless it's beyond reason, unless it detaches itself from all reasons. And it's more sophisticated than that for him, but that's sort of the way that he's been received in society. So you've got this modern idea that modern rational people have reason and Christian people and other religions have faith. And what Keller does is he comes along and he says, that's really far too simplistic, because both sides have both reason and faith. So the Christian, for example, will have a number of reasons for believing what she believes, and there are some sort of classic Christian reasons there. One can look historically with the tools of the historian at the events around Jesus' death and resurrection, and one can quite reasonably come to the conclusion that one of the most persuasive ways of accounting for all the historical evidence that we've got is that Jesus did in fact rise from the dead, and so forth. And there are, books and books and books on this sort of thing. But ultimately, those evidences and those arguments won't make you a Christian. And you eventually, sooner or later, have to trust God. And then once you do, and you trust his promises, you can corroborate through your own experience the truth of what you were being pushed towards through the evidences. Once you trust God and he comes through on his promises and answers prayer and so forth, you come to the position where you say, I cannot conceive that this could now be false. Like, this is beyond reasonable doubt for me. But you can't get that far from the outside just by looking at it. And so there's commitment, there's trust, and there's reason on the side of the Christian. But Keller would say there's also the same dynamic on the side of the so-called unbeliever, because no view of the world can account for itself and can ground itself. And there are some sort of classic examples of this. So for example, I only believe things that have been demonstrated empirically to me, someone might say. And then, it would be quite legitimate to ask, well, has that principle itself been empirically demonstrated? And no, it hasn't. Well, then you don't just believe things that have been empirically demonstrated to you. Your very principle is an exception to itself. And you have to take it sooner or later on faith. You have to commit to that principle and then see how the world works out, and then, see where you end up. And Keller would say, therefore, that there's a commitment required regardless of your view of the world. And it's just that commitment gets labelled faith in a religious framework, and it doesn't get labelled anything. It gets sort of airbrushed out of the picture in terms of secular frameworks. And so everybody has faith, he would say. And the question, therefore, is not, do you have faith or do you not? But what are you putting your faith in? And how able is it to take the weight of the faith that you're putting in, putting on it?
Yeah. Maybe you can elaborate a bit further about just that. Yeah, what are you putting your faith into? Because I love how you talk about as well. I think it's the idea from the City of God or Augustine's work of how culture needs to serve something. So if you're putting your faith in things that can't hold that, then that's going to come crumbling. Like, I think a current example is that individualism in society. So the constant, like, you need to look to yourself. But we're seeing very clearly that making ourselves our own gods, we can't uphold that. So yeah, maybe you can talk a bit into, we're either shaped by that certain kingdom, and whether that kingdom is beneficial or helpful or good or evil. Yeah.
It's a really, really penetrating question, isn't it? I think, and again, Tim Keller, I think, better than almost anyone else, has really articulated what's at stake here. And this argument is sort of heavily in debt to the way that he expressed it. And the idea is that everybody commits themselves to something or someone, and we get our identity from that thing or from that person, and we get our sense of worth from that thing or from that person. So, for example, for perhaps many people in our societies, we derive our sense of worth and achievement and performance and identity from our success in the workplace. And if I'm recognized as being outstanding in my field, and being a great employee or a great business leader or whatever it is, whatever my work is, then I feel great about myself and I feel justified in the sense that, my life is a good one. It's going somewhere really good. But if I get fired or whatever, then I don't just lose my job, I lose myself in a really quite fundamental way. My world falls apart, and, it's more than just losing an income source. There's something fundamental to who I am that's been unpicked by losing my job. And whereas for some people that's job, for others it's family. It can be a spouse. It can be a relationship with one's children that I derive my sense of who I am and my sense of being justified, being right from. And it can be my own sense of myself. I set myself some criteria. My life will be a success if, this, that, or the other. And then I meet that and I feel fantastic and fabulous. I fail to meet that and I feel an absolute failure as a person. And so we've each got something that fills that space for us. And I think Keller would say it's impossible to live without something in that space. You can't get out of bed in the morning and make decisions without some hierarchy of values and some sense of who you are. And something has to be at the top of that hierarchy. And something has to be the foundation of who you are. So nobody's sitting on the sidelines looking in at this from the crowd. And therefore the question again becomes, well, what can take that weight, or who can take that weight? Because that's a pretty heavy burden to put on someone, like giving them or giving a thing the responsibility of defining you as a person and justifying you as a person. So, you better choose carefully, because if you choose wrongly, that can go really, really badly. And then I think, it's not a huge leap to think, well, does my career love me? And I think it would be a great stretch for almost all of us to say, yes, it does. I'm useful to my employer. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's just how jobs work. But my employer doesn't love me in any fundamental sense. If they need to get rid of me, I have no doubt that they will. So it would be foolish of me to invest a deep sense of my identity in that relationship. And similarly, even a spouse or a child, if they're anything like me, then they're sinful and flawed and changeable over time, and they can't bear the weight. And it wouldn't be fair on them to make them bear the weight of justifying me either. In fact, the only one who is both powerful enough, wise enough to bear that weight, and also compassionate enough not to abuse it, is the Christ, creator of heaven and earth, who died for me, demonstrating how much he is for me, demonstrating that he's not going to mess around with me if I commit my identity to him. You don't die for someone and then play a joke on them in the next breath. You demonstrate your love through dying, and I think we can take that as Christ saying, I'm not messing around. I'm for you. I've committed myself to you in an ultimate way. You can trust me. I'm not going to turn around and blow raspberries at you. And I think at that point, Christ is the only one with both the ability and the compassion to bear that weight of defining me and justifying me. So as Keller says, we really would be very superficial and tragic to try and make anything else, including our own sense of ourselves, bear that weight that Christ alone can bear for us.
That's beautiful. Yeah.
Could I ask you, Chris, sorry, I love what you said, no one dies for us, and then plays a joke on us in the next breath. I've never quite heard anyone describe the gospel like that, but it's great. I guess in light of that, those Christians who are journeying, and as they start to think about things, they struggle through their faith. And so I guess and it's an impossible question, but I'm going to ask you to have a go at it. But is it a crisis of their faith, or is their worldview not aligned? Is it not aligned and not congruent? It's impossible to diagnose, but as Christians read more, study more, think more, and then find a crisis of faith, what do you think's going on for them?
Thank you, Mark. I think, as you say, it's a question that it's almost impossible to answer, because in each person's particular circumstances, there'll be different things feeding into that. So there isn't like everybody going through a crisis of faith fits this single blueprint type diagnosis. There's, for some people, there's a lot of inherent personality. I might be an anxious person by nature, and that might be feeding into it. For other people, life crises, life circumstances might be a big factor. For some people in situations like that, some personal sin that I'm cultivating and not repenting of might be key. For others, it might not be key. So there's no one size fits all sort of thing. But I think the wonderful thing about being a Christian and finding my identity and my worth and my justification outside of me, as opposed to almost all of the N-shaped dynamic ways of doing life, which find my identity in my performance in some way or another, is that it doesn't really matter how strong my faith is, providing that it's in the right thing. So the illustration is sometimes given in sermons, isn't it, of two people who walk into a room. One just strides over to a chair and throws themselves down on it, without giving it a second thought. And the second person sort of shuffles into the room and looks very tentatively at the chair and wonders if it might hold them, and then sort of shuffles around it and shakes it a little bit, and then ends up very tentatively sitting down. And the illustration goes something like, the first person had huge, great, unshakable faith in the chair, and it held them up. And the second person had a very shaky, wobbly faith in the chair, and it held them up just as well as the first chair did. So in other words, it's not the quality of the faith that's the determining factor, it's the quality of the chair. Okay. And so I suppose I'm trying to say in a very roundabout way what Jesus said in about 5 or 10 words. If you got faith as small as a mustard seed, essentially, it's all about the one you're putting that faith in, not about examining the quality of the faith itself. So if someone is going through a crisis of faith, one thing that might be helpful, and again, everyone's different. There's some people this might be helpful for, some people it won't, is to look gloriously away from your lack of faith and towards the one whom the faith is in, and contemplate him and his trustworthiness, and again, the fact that he died for you. So, he's pretty committed to you. And if you put even the smallest grain of trust in him, he's going to come through for you. So don't worry so much about your faith. Glory and rest in who he is and his ability to bear the weight of that faith.
That's awesome. I love how, you've done it multiple times through this conversation, but it's just beautiful how we talking about, and how you keep bringing culturally, especially in academic places, like critique is all about deconstruction and pulling things apart. And you keep drawing.
Yes, there is a sense in which those two things are opposed, but there's also perhaps a sense in which what I'm doing is trying to pull things apart.
Yeah.
Because when you dig down from a Christian point of view and try and get to the most fundamental thing about the universe, like when you strip away all the sort of froth on the surface and say, what is the most basic reality in our universe, or even outside our universe, in the case of the Bible, what you get down to, the bedrock that your stone strikes against eventually is God. And God is personal. God's a Trinity. Christ is a person of the Trinity. So you can't pull him apart. He's not, matter or energy. They're not more fundamental than Christ within a biblical view of the world. They are actually contingent upon Christ. Colossians 1, Hebrews 1. Those things rely on him. He is more fundamental than they are. And so to find Christ at the bedrock of reality is sort of doing what, those people who are analysing and deconstructing are doing, because they're trying to pull apart things that are not fundamental and show you what they're made of. And that's exactly what the Christian is doing when they're saying, no, actually, matter or even time are not really fundamental. They're not the most fundamental thing, so to speak, in the universe or even beyond the universe. That is actually personal. You can't break down God's personality, his character, into more fundamental parts. This is the doctrine of divine simplicity. God is not made up of parts. He's not made up of whatever it is, atoms, or even elements of his character. God is whole, and you can't analyze him further than that. And so that is a fundamentally analytic move that, from a Christian point of view.
Right. But that does require quite a bit of faith, or there's quite a bit of mystery when you hit that bedrock, right?
Yeah, I mean, there's mystery for every view of the world, isn't there? People working hard with a Large Hadron Collider at the moment, trying to figure out what on earth is this thing called matter, and is there this thing called dark matter, and what are the fundamental particles of the universe? So it's not as if all the mystery is on the Christian side and everyone else is just saying, yeah, we got it sorted out. We know exactly what the universe is made of.
So I wonder, C.S. Lewis suggests that if we see through everything, we end up seeing nothing, or something along those lines. So how do we navigate that tension then with what you're saying is that we can analyze, because I agree, but then there's this tension that we are wrestling with as Christians.
You always, in order to analyze, you always need a lens through which you're looking, really, because the world is just too complex, and there's just too much information out there to take account of everything. So we've all got to filter, the Christian and the non-Christian, because you can't deal with everything. I think that psychologists say I can't remember the numbers. There's so many millions of bits of information that come to our senses, our five senses, every second, and it's like the brain can process about 5 of those or something. I don't know the numbers, but a tiny fraction of the information we're getting. So we're all filtering all the time. And the question is, how do you filter? How do you decide what not to pay attention to? And everybody has a way. Often it's not thought through. You don't get up in the morning and think, now, how shall I decide what to pay attention to today? It just sort of happens because we're all catechized in a particular culture that's telling us all the time, take note of this, pay attention to this, value this. And so we just sort of do because that's the sort of beings we are. And the Bible is doing that to us as well. The Bible is saying, notice this, pay attention to this. The heavens declare the glory of God. Notice that next time you look up at the sky, or notice the widows and orphans among you as a society in a way that they might have been invisible to you before. And so, again, the question is not whether we're filtering, but it's on what basis we're filtering, and whether, A, we know, like we've ever thought about, how am I deciding, what are the influences that have led me to my particular sense of what to ignore and what to see. And cross-cultural engagement is really, really helpful for this. So often different cultures will see very, very different things in the same situations or the same events. And, you look at the person next to you, if they're from a very different culture to you, and they say, what? I don't get how you're getting that out of this, but it's just different enculturation. And so rubbing up against people from different cultures can help us to begin to see, oh my goodness, the way that I see the world is not just common sense. It's actually got a history and it's got a geography, and not everybody has always seen the world like I do. And that's quite confronting when it happens for the first time, but also incredibly helpful. And the great thing, just one final point, the great thing about doing this from a Christian point of view, especially for people like you and me who are living in modern Western countries, is that the Bible is not our book. It wasn't written by modern Western people who see the world like we do. And it wasn't, in fact, written by just one sort of person either. It was written over a number of centuries in two main languages, and then a third little bonus language for a few chapters of the Old Testament. And it's written to, communities who are under occupation or self-governing or slaves in Egypt or in exile. And so it's not monocultural. And you can't read the Bible just through one narrow cultural lens and understand even the Bible in its own terms. So the Bible's always forcing you to broaden your cultural perspective. And especially for us, because a lot of the Bible is not intuitive for us. We've been catechized into a way of seeing the world that is not in beautiful harmony with the Bible. And so we'll read some passages and we'll think, oh, that makes me feel quite uncomfortable. I don't know if I like that in the Bible. And those are the moments when we can rejoice, because we know we're being challenged to get out of our own cultural bubble and to open ourselves to the possibility that the world may not be exactly as we've always been taught to think that it is. And the Bible does that in a way that a book that had just been written within the last 5 years within a Western country, it wouldn't do that in the same way, because it would share almost all of our assumptions.
Yeah, I love that. What's something that perhaps that you've noticed particularly or specific to Western culture that a lens that we view the Bible as is unhelpful?
Well, I have been told, and part of the problem is that, I, like you and like everyone else, shares these assumptions, so you can't discover your own blind spots by definition, because there wouldn't be blind spots if you could. But stuff I've read by people who come from different cultures, it is that we view the Bible through a really quite aggressively individualistic lens. It's all about the individual, whereas the sort of the heartbeat of the Bible itself is quite a lot more communal and community focused than we've got categories for in the West. Now, the beautiful thing is that the Bible also challenges those cultures that think about everything through the lens of community and don't value the individual as well. And so there are two books that have come out in recent decades, really different to each other, but that make this combined point. So the French philosopher Alain Badiou, no Christian, really died in the world communist guy, doesn't like Christianity, but he wrote a book on Paul, the Apostle Paul. And he said that Paul is the foundation of universalism, the idea that there can be a community with its doors open to everybody, not just people of a particular ethnicity or gender or social class. He said that is a fundamentally Pauline idea. So this idea of an inclusive community, and then of course that works its way out in the 2,000 years since, in a sort of those societies that have been influenced by Christianity embrace this idea of the universal. We don't want to exclude people, inclusivity and so forth. And then a very different sort of book written by the historian Larry Siedentop, argues that, I think the title of the book is The Birth of the Individual, that St. Paul, is at the origin of the idea of the individual, that it's not just my place in the system that counts, it's me before God. God wants my heart. He doesn't just want someone to perform the role of whatever it is. It's not just the community. God wants me. What I believe, what I feel about him counts. And that's sort of the birth of the individual, the idea that, by the grace of God, I am what I am, not just here we are as a group. And to the extent that Badiou and Siedentop both have a point, the Bible is in a way that no culture has fully embraced or grasped. It's going full out on the individual, unloading both barrels on individuality, saying that is massively important. And also being white hot on community and saying, if you understand yourselves only as individuals, you're falling massively short of the biblical paradigm. Because we, the body of Christ, the building, the temple, all these images in the Bible that talk about the togetherness of people. And every culture falls off that donkey on one side or the other. Western, quote unquote, cultures overemphasize the individual, and some other cultures overemphasize the communal. But both of them are challenged and corrected by the Bible. So it's always by coming back to the Bible that we challenge our own cultural blind spots, but not in a way that exalts any one culture over all the others. That's the beauty of it. That's the point of it. The Bible can't be claimed by any one specific culture.
Yeah, that's beautiful, and it talks. You talk about this as well, and you've mentioned it briefly there about how Christ doesn't conform to any single one culture, and why that's so integral for us to understand. So I'm wondering, how does that idea that Christ doesn't comfortably fit into any one particular culture impact the way we as Christians should engage with society?
Ewan, that's a really interesting spin on that question. I guess it means that the message we ought to be giving off is not be like me. And we don't want to conform society to our own image. What I'm talking about, we as fallen human beings with all our cultural, baggage and prejudices and blind spots. What we want to invite people to do is stand shoulder to shoulder with us and look away from both us and them, actually, towards the one who we've been talking about throughout this conversation, who did make them and died for them, and before whom they will stand alongside us on the final day and have to give an account for everything we've done. So we're not saying be like us. We're saying join us in trying to become like him, because he's the one who's worthy. Like, we're not worthy. Don't hold us up on a pedestal, because God doesn't, and we shouldn't. And when we do, call us out for it, because that's not right. But there is one who can be held up, because and John makes this point, John makes this metaphor. We can hold him up because he was held up. He was raised up on a cross. And that is how, he demonstrates his love for us. That is how he demonstrates that he's worthy to hold this weight of finding our identity in him, that we were talking about a while ago. And so our invitation to culture as Christians is not look at us. Please look alongside us, away from ourselves, towards the one that we're trying to look at. And join us in seeking to be more like him, both individually, of course, both in embracing Christ within our own hearts, but also in trying to remake society in his image. And this is what I go into a lot in the book, how the Bible sets forth patterns and rhythms for thinking about society that are profoundly healthy and rich and subtle and more adequate to the breadth of human experience than a lot of the paradigms that are dominant, which are often simplifications of biblical truths or half-truths, forgetting the other half and just blowing up part of the truth to become the whole truth. And that squeeze and squash human beings into less than human ways of being and interacting with each other. Whereas I think that the invitation that we can hold open to the culture is that the Bible doesn't squeeze and squash us. If, as Jesus said, if the Son sets you free, you're free indeed. There's a life to the fullness about finding oneself in Christ, but that's also, and I'm sorry, I know this is response is going on, but there's one more point that if I don't make it, people are going to scream at their podcast and say, yes, but what about these verses? So let me just say, but that is also paradoxical. Is Jesus saying those who seek to save their life will lose it? So if you try and hold on to what you've got, you will end up tragically finding that it runs through your fingers like sand. But those who lose their lives for my sake and for the gospel will find it. So there's a letting go of oneself and one's own agenda that's necessary in order ultimately to find it. And it's like Paul says in 1 Corinthians 1, Greeks, you seek wisdom, Jews, you look for miraculous signs. I'm coming to you with weakness and foolishness. This is not what you think you're looking for. But if you come to the cross, if you embrace what he calls the word of the cross, the logos of the cross, you'll find that God's foolishness is wiser than human wisdom and his weakness is stronger than human strength. In other words, everything that you're searching for in all the wrong places is actually to be found in the cross. Although for you, it looks like the least likely place ever to find those things that you're looking for. And you've got to undergo a massive paradigm shift to start looking for these things at the cross, because it seems perverse and weird to you to do so. So what I'm trying to get over, clumsily, I think, is that it's not straightforward. Like, there's a real challenge. There's a repentance. There's a metanoia that's required in order to travel this path. But there's also an ultimate, glorious, surprising, riotous fulfillment of the longings of society to be found along this path as well, if we can go via the cross to find it.
Yeah, that's brilliant. Did you want to?
Yeah, I'd love to ask a personal question. Chris, I think you're demonstrating it in your answering anyway, but I think there's a humility and a confidence and a graciousness that comes. But the question I guess I'm intrigued by is, the more and more you get known and the more and more that your book is read, you become more of a, it's the author of, you become less, in a sense, less of a person and more of, this is your body of work. And so I just want to take a step back to go, well, obviously this theology and the studies in philosophy, you've said, since a teen, has shaped you slowly. And I'm super curious how you personally, as a follower of Jesus, have been shaped by this journey, impacted. Your book is going to be appreciated and devoured, and you're going to be, and you are increasingly just known widely. But at the end of the day, you're a follower of Jesus who has been massively impacted by this journey. And if it's fair to ask the question, if you could just kind of share how have you been personally impacted?
I think if I understand the question rightly, I think it's been a wonderful voyage of discovery. So I remember the first Bible overview that I ever did away on a Christian summer camp on a junior leaders program. And the way in which that just opened a whole universe for me of, oh my goodness, the Bible is one story. Like, it's a complex story. It's multi-layered. There are sub-stories and side chapters, as I think it's Richard Bauckham calls it. And so it's not just one narrative, one single storyline. But all the best novels are not one single storyline either, are they? From beginning to end. And that just opened up a whole new way of seeing the world. And then, with the different Christian philosophers that I've discovered over the years, Herman Doiviet, Francis Schaeffer was really influential earlier on, John Stott again, Tim Keller. They're opening up aspects of God's truth that just lead you to marvel at the wisdom of God. Augustine is probably the biggest one, and I don't claim to have anything approaching an adequate understanding of the City of God, but the bits I do understand are just mind-blowing. Like on the first page of the City of God, Augustine does more than most people do in a lifetime, literally, than most people do in a lifetime of writing. And I don't think I'm exaggerating. I'm not intending to exaggerate. Mastery, the idea that people are mastered by their own mastery, and the very first word in the Latin, gloriosissimam, we could do a podcast on those two things, both on the first page, and both of them are just mind-blowing. And so the deeper you get into it, I guess, the more you think, oh my goodness, God is so wise. Like, it's this idea, isn't it, that we're scrabbling up the mountain, and every mountain you climb up, you find God there waiting for you, saying, yeah, I'm glad you're sort of catching up with what I've been, my wisdom, and all our little sort of attempts at wisdom are tiny drops in the ocean of his wisdom. And the more you read, the more you think that is really profoundly true. Like, the Bible is just so unfathomably and richly wise about human beings and how we roll and what society is and how it works and all that sort of stuff. And of course, of many other things as well. It's just that those are my particular focus. And so it's a treat, to be able to do the reading and discover these things and then write about them and hopefully, by God's grace, bless other people as they learn about these things too. It's just, it's fantastic.
I love it. Yeah, thank you so much. It's I just find your passion and your enjoyment about just even in this conversation, really encouraging. And just in closing, one of the conversations I've been having recently with a few different people, or the themes that keep coming up, is this recognition that a lot of Christians who perhaps are young, not young in their faith, just age-wise, sort of struggle with the confidence or assurance they have in their faith, or this boldness. So I was wondering, maybe you can comment on that, and then perhaps what's an encouragement for those people who it's not that they have a lack of belief, but it's just maybe they in this turmoil of so many different cultural opinions and voices and different lenses to look at things through is overwhelming, or maybe it's a different reason. But what's an encouragement for Christians to be bold in their faith?
Yeah, thank you. I haven't been young recently, and so I speak with the perspective of someone who's not in that world, and that's significant because, culture changes, and to go to school, high school now is not the same experience as going to high school when I went to high school. So I'm a bit of an outsider, but I'll try my best.
Or even university or something like that.
Yeah. I think the first thing to know, and I don't know whether this is an encouragement or not, is that we're not the first generation to have had struggles in this area. You can imagine the family bringing up, the Christian son or daughter in the first century and saying, well, honey, there are these things called lions, and occasionally Christians have to meet them. It's not as if Christians have had it, ever so cushy up until 30 years ago. And now suddenly, oh my goodness, everything's changed, and life is so terrible for Christians. And so there's a huge wealth of wisdom to draw on. Like, Christians have been thinking about how to live in tough contexts for thousands of years. And there are books like Daniel in the Bible that talk very specifically about how to live in a place that doesn't understand what you believe and is very, very sure about what it believes and jolly well expects you to agree with it. And so there are massive resources in the Bible for trying to work this out. I think one helpful principle is this thing again of I can't remember who came up with this little proverb, but it's really helpful. For one look within, take 10 looks at him. In other words, don't obsess about how hard it is for you, but look at Jesus. And, is he worthy? Are you, is your heart full of praise for him? Do you really like the fact that he's your king? And are you quite excited about that? And if not, then I guess and this is the case for all of us, like none of us are there, are we? That, there's work for us to do with open Bibles, meditating on God's word on our knees, getting to the point where we are actually really chuffed that he's our king and really quite excited about that. And then when that's the case, it's just a case of seeking for appropriate opportunities to share some of that. And the New Testament doesn't set the bar, superhumanly high for this. It doesn't say, you must convert 10 people a year, and if you're not spot on every time, the door is open at least a crack and you jump in there and give a full-fledged gospel presentation, then shame on you. It says always, first of all, in your heart set apart Christ Jesus as Lord, which is, I think, this principle of, are you actually, convinced and happy that he's Lord? Is there something in there to share, essentially? And then always be prepared to give an answer to anyone who asks for the reason for the hope that you have. So there's an assumption there that you're going to live a bit differently. Like, it's going to be clear to people that there's a hope in you that's not universal. So your life's got to look a bit different. But I think, as a Christian, it's not hard to see how our lives might look different to the lives of people around us. And then when that raises people's eyebrows, have something to say about it. So we don't individually have to sort of conquer the culture for Christ or whatever language people might use, but it's have something to share, be ready to share it. And when the opportunity comes, have something to say. And, whether you're at high school or wherever else you are, with a God who fills us with his Spirit and gives us words to say and prepares us, and is not standing over us with a stick to bash us when we get it wrong either, but who is a gracious God, I think you can see what it might look like to live that way, even in, school, which is one of the hardest places to live for Christ, but one of the most crucial ones as well, and university as well, because people are still making their minds up at that age. People get harder as they get older, don't they? It's not that God can't break through, but there's more to break through than when you're little. You get a mortgage, you get a family or whatever, and you don't want the boat rocking at that point. It's like, don't touch me. I'm set. Whereas when you're at school or when you're at university, you're still more supple, more flexible, more open to ideas, more willing to think that there might be something out there that's significant that you haven't come across yet. And so those are absolutely key times for Christians to be, giving answers to people who ask them for the hope that they have. But it's also a really hard time because school can be vicious and not always, of course, but the environment of being at school is not an easy one to be a Christian.
Thanks so much. That's really helpful and encouraging.
And so just one more final point on that. Again, there's a liberation in knowing that we're not pointing to ourselves. We're not saying to people, be like me. We're pointing both ourselves and other people away from ourselves and saying there is one who it's worth thinking about and being like, and it's not me, thank goodness, but it's him. Let me show you who this one is like.
That's awesome. Yeah. Thanks so much, Chris. The conversation's been really helpful and really encouraging throughout. And it's clear that you've obviously thought a lot about this, and your book, as you said, you've spent the last 15 to 20 years thinking about it, and then now you've got it on paper. So hopefully our listeners have had a slight taste of that, and they're encouraged to go pick it up and just start wrestling with it as well. And I know if we haven't done a great job of showing that, Tim Keller has done an amazing forward for you in that book as well. So yeah, thanks so much for taking the time and having the conversation with us today.
It's been a real joy, Caleb and Matt. Thank you so much for your probing, thoughtful questions. It's been lovely chatting with you.
Likewise. Thanks so much, Chris.
Thanks, Chris.